have Her Excellency Professor Ameenah Gurib-Fakim joining us here in the Happy Smart City Forum's discussion. I will admit this is also for my own selfish reasons, because I've always been fascinated by her work, and I follow, her media appearances and so forth. I'd just like to get this out of the way for myself personally. I really admire the fact that you moved from science into becoming Vice Chancellor, if I'm correct, and then becoming head of state.
As you have rightly said, my story is unusual. I've had really an unusual career. But to answer to this comment that you have made, I think was underpinned by a few words that I will use, and I think we can discuss this later on. It was driven by risk-taking, and I got this appetite for taking risk because I think I had a father, my late father, unfortunately. He actually instilled that in me by believing in me. The other word that comes to mind straight away is passion. And the last one is just tenacity. Just get in there and stay there until you get what you want.
Of course, of course. So if we may begin, I would first like to ask, what is sustainable development and what are the key metrics for sustainable development?
Sustainable development, people tend to think of it as something which has been hatched since 2015. But I think sustainable development, if you really look at it very closely, is humanity delivering on the Declaration of Human Rights right after the Second World War. And the metrics I think that we will have to adopt is how successful we have been in holding that promise. Because as we speak, there are 17 SDGs. Each SDG is a system in itself. And each SDG is, they are all equally important. But I think our success on delivering the SDGs is the results on the ground. And here I'll have to caveat what I'm going to say is that, with the COVID, whatever gains we have made over the past decades, I think we have seen that eroding away very, very fast, almost like snow in the sun. And this is so true for Africa because this continent was doing so well by all metrics in terms of reform of the economies, and this was acknowledged by many multilateral organizations. And to come with some cliche, a few decades ago, this continent was heralded as a hopeless continent. This was the running title of some important magazines. And 20 years later, we said we're a rising continent. So things have been happening. Unfortunately, the COVID has set us back quite a bit. And what we're witnessing now is rising hunger, increased poverty, and people being shunted more into poverty in many parts of Africa. But I think we should not be losing hope. We should not lose hope in as much as this continent by 2050 or slightly before will be the greatest purveyor of talent.
It was, you were talking about how Africa for a very long time was said to be a hopeless continent, but it appears that young people are rising today and things will get better.
I'm a strong believer in the youth of Africa. They have all that it takes. And what I'm seeing also, and I think I consider this a very strong plus point, is the pride to be African. And that to me is significant because I think we are finally shedding the vestige of our colonial heritage. And we're happy to connect with the people, we're happy to connect with the earth, we're happy to connect with our tradition and our culture. And I think that's very powerful. So if we empower them, if we invest in them, I think this continent will move leaps and bounds. And this is exactly what we need. And I use the word investment very, very strongly, not sparingly, because for too long we have considered education, especially educating our young people, an issue for other people to do and not ourselves. And the time has come that we consider this as an investment in our people and we contribute the appropriate level of GDP, not just in primary, secondary, but also tertiary education, because this is where the challenge, this is where the challenges will be addressed through the manpower, through the human resource, the human capital that we have at that level where transformation can happen.
I agree with you 100%. And I'm going to borrow from something that I heard you say in a previous discussion before. You talked about Africa's biodiversity. And now you talk about investing in young people. These are very fundamental issues, because for me, I think one of the most fascinating things, and one of the things that really shaped my mind growing up, I did the IB diploma, and we used to have the Model United Nations, which was kind of like a simulation of the UN. And in one of our simulations, I was chief delegate of South Korea. And what I learned there after the Second World War is people look at South Korea today as, the best internet connection, the going, full 5G, now looking into 6G and what that looks like. But South Korea was in rubble after the Second World War. And their country grew fundamentally from the ground up. They started as an agrarian economy and then graduated into logistics, because obviously when you're in agriculture, you have to transport efficiently, store the goods efficiently in order to have a robust industry. But then, once you start doing that well in exporting, then your finance comes into play, your stock markets come into play, and all these financial instruments. So I agree 100% that investing in young people is something that should be paramount on the agendas of our leaders today. But I guess now the follow-up question to that would be, what is investing in young people? And how would that look like to you?
I'm glad that you raised the South Korean model. Because, in the 1950s, immediately after the Korean War, as you said, the country was completely bombed, it was destroyed. And immediately after this, by the early 60s, the Korean leadership was sending people out to Africa. And, at that particular point, the GDP of South Korea, was almost equivalent to one of a GDP of a West African country, for example. And now we can see how the country has moved in leaps and bounds ahead, and is now a powerhouse. Now, if we look at, you talked about metrics earlier on, we talked about education. I mentioned education very strong, and this is exactly what South Korea did. Every 10 years, it started investing in one layer of their education. So we started with the primary, they started with the secondary, and then 30 years later, tertiary. And then at the same time, the country looked at its strength, looked at the priorities. And they realized very quickly that one of the priorities they can actually go into was, for example, the electronics. And we see also the emergence of cars. And now we see Hyundai, for example, as one of the flagship of coming out of this country. So this is what we have to prioritize. Again, come back to the quality of the education. That I was privileged because I had a father who believed in educating his daughter as much as his son, equal opportunities for both of us. But is the quality of the education I got, is the education I received rather as a child, is it still relevant for my daughter? It is certainly not going to be relevant for my grandchild one day, hopefully. So what we have to do now is be very mindful of the quality of education we impart to our young children. We increasingly have to stop this notion of rote learning, because there are computers for that now. They don't have to memorize things. They have to learn to do things with their hands. The education that we have to impart is an education that actually encourages critical thinking, because this is going to be the future of, the future as we see it happening in front of us. So this is the quality of education we have to impart, and an education that is fit for purpose. Now, this is, of course, at the primary level, secondary level. At the tertiary level, our universities, we cannot keep on with massification at our universities. We have to privilege certain key areas that we have to invest in. And here I also talk about the research which is going on in our universities. How are we empowering the researchers to become innovators? I beg your pardon. To become innovators, to translate their research findings into an enterprise. Where is the ecosystem in Africa? Where are the incubators? I mean, I'll not forget about the unicorns. Where are the incubators? Where are the ecosystem that will promote entrepreneurship arising from academic research? I mean, that's one thing. Now, if you look at impact research, if you look at research that can really make a difference on the ground, how much investment is the private sector or even the government, for that matter, putting in? And this is exactly the model of South Korea, because as the years went by, the government was matching the research investment in these institutions. So these are the models that we have to adopt. I'm not going to say we have to copy, but we're going to have to take the best example, the best practices, and apply it. And there is no dearth of research findings on this continent. There's so much happening, but we don't see, because these research results hardly cross the infamous valley of death to get to the other side. And I again use the example of Facebook. We saw how a philanthropist, when he gave that $100,000 to Zuckerberg to register to go to Palo Alto and register that company. I mean, now we can see we have a giant. So this is the kind of culture we have to inculcate, and we have to keep on preaching to our private sector to look at what's happening in our institution. And this is again where we need to have increasingly more private sector people sitting on the benches of universities, sitting on the boards of universities, so that they can see what's the talent which are coming out of these places, but more importantly, ensure that the curriculum is fit for purpose, not just for their company, but for the country at large and the region. So there's a lot of homework to be done at that level from our side.
Very, very true, of course. And when I think about the economics involved, when you talk about engaging the private sector, very much in Africa, the situation has always been that our leaders are selected based on personality and how charismatic they are, not so much, about what they can achieve or what the track record has been. Of course, things are changing. And there's a very, very, long list that's coming up of amazing leaders who've proven themselves in the economy. But things haven't been so, and there's still this lag of prosperity. Now, what I'm thinking is, to what extent is this feasible right now when we talk about the market economy requiring support from private sector? How viable is it? What are the pathways?
It's always very tempting to look at the glass being half empty as opposed to seeing the glass half full. I always posit this because Africa's history, the economic history, the way for self-determination has only been around 60 plus years. So we have to also view it through that lens. I'm not saying that we have to view the future of Africa through that lens all the time, but we have to take that on board. What did we see about 40 years ago? Most of the leadership of Africa, they were generals from the army, as you have rightly said, but things are changing. And I think we have to look at also some of the reforms which have been happening. And we have seen also that Africa has decided to take its destiny in her hand by addressing the internal market through the AfCFTA. So we have to move, we have an internal market of 1.4 billion. It's a continent which has so many resources. As I said earlier on, the human capital is there. The minerals are there, the resources underground are there. But I think beyond this...
My apologies, Your Excellency. Was that 1.4 billion or trillion?
Our resources?
No, you mentioned we have an internal market of 1.4
billion. It's 1.4, the population of Africa. right?
The population.
It's won about 1.4 billion. And we are hoping to create an internal market of 1.4 billion. And again, I don't see why, for example, food produced in West Africa can't be sold to East Africa and Southern Africa. It has to be done. And unfortunately, as we speak, the manufacturing within the continent is only about, it's a measly 3%. This is the WTO figures. Having said this, there is progress, because if you look at in the 1980s, about 40% of the population in Africa was living below the $2 mark, as described as by the metrics used by the World Bank, for example. But recently, the same figure has dropped to 10%. So things are happening, but maybe not fast enough. But again, to come back to your initial question of your question was about how do we do making happen on the continent, right? We just have to keep on working. We have to keep on investing. We have to keep on promoting our own, as I said, culture, tradition, you name it. I think there's so much that can be done on this continent. We have it. But unfortunately, we're also living in a world where geopolitics plays a very important role. And we find a lot of interference on the continent. And this is a reality we have to live with, because Africa is still a continent rich in resources, which of course in high demand from other places. But we have to look at the governance structure on our continent and see to it that the resources work for ourselves as well. I mean, we cannot have a country like DRC, the size it is. It is almost driving the telephone industry, the mobile industry. And look at the state of that particular country. There are good stories as well. We have seen, for example, M-Pesa, which has come out from East Africa. But again, the IP doesn't belong to Africa. The IP belongs elsewhere. So this is the kind of thought process that has to go into within the decision-making process on the continent to see to it that it works for the continent.
I'm going to be tempted to pick your brain on something there, because I mean, we both agree that there's so many challenges on the continent. The resource curse, obviously, and just the sheer diversity of culture, tribe, and all of the things that are innate to us that don't have to do with the outside world. You've seen the continent from academia, you've seen it from, the highest rank in public office. And then as an entrepreneur, those entrepreneurs are the most dynamic people out there. So I'm just curious for you, in terms of financing the development programs in Africa, which are the key ones? You did talk about, investing in young people, but if I were to ask for the silver bullet, when you sit back and say, that's it right there, what are those, few ones that you can say, I can put money here right now, and I guarantee you there's going to be some structural shifts?
The past 2 years has highlighted many of Africa's weaknesses. The COVID, in a way, has done us a favor because it has done our SWOT. We have seen a lot of the weaknesses, and two sectors where we have been very weak has been in the health sector and has been in agriculture, right? People have to feed themselves. We've seen how food insecurity has been prevalent in many parts of our continent. We have seen how the vaccine inequity has really affected us. Now, how come a continent of 1.4 billion people will still depend on handouts from elsewhere? Why can't we be producing our own medications, our own vaccines? Why is it that we cannot be going into the high-end technology? We have the resources, we have the capital, we have the manpower, we have everything, but we need to get our act together. And agriculture, again, is a low-lying fruit. Because 60% of the world's arable land they are in this continent. And if you go back the African Development Bank figures, it will tell you that only this sector can weigh almost $1 trillion. Now, if you look at this sector weighing $1 trillion. If we look at the internal market of Africa, right, through the AFCFTA, if we look at manufacturing, if we look at processing, if we look at reducing the wastage from agriculture, because we waste a lot post-harvest. Now, if you look at the power of innovation of our young people, I mean, this sector can easily become, I would say conservatively, a $2 trillion business. And at the same time, provide jobs, not just for the men, especially for the women, because let us face it, women feed Africa. So if we empower her with the right technology, if we empower with education, the land, access to the capital, I mean, we're going to see a thriving Africa being able to export. And, you know, the issue of, I mean, I know one head of state said, I mean, how can we expect a 44 million country, 44 million people country like Ukraine, saying that they will be addressing the food insecurity on the continent for 1.4 billion people? It doesn't make sense. So having said this, agriculture faces a big challenge, the challenge of climate change, because it's rain-fed. 85% of Africa's agriculture is still rain-fed. So we're going to have to move very, very fast to look at crops that will be able to adapt to a changing climate. And again here, if we look at a staple like wheat, which grows very well in Ukraine, we have the equivalent in Africa that is capable of addressing our food security, our sorghum. The modest sorghum is able to withstand changing climate, drought, you name it, and still give you a good yield that will feed its country wherever it's being grown. So there are so many of these low-lying fruit. Now, coming back to health, I'll go back again to traditional medicine, because I have spent my entire life working on this. Traditional medicine in Africa, we are talking about over 75% of the entire continent still depend on this for primary health care. Now, if we look at traditional medicine, if you look at medicinal plant, if we have trading standards that can actually shape that sector, I mean, just imagine what can that do. And this is exactly what I tried to do when I moved from academia into translating my research into enterprise, is to precisely put that scientific framework around herbal knowledge so that we can get cheap and affordable, but more importantly, culturally acceptable medicine. And this is again something, a low-lying fruit, we can help solve a lot of our primary healthcare problems.
You know, I'm just going to hit on a few points that you mentioned, and all very strong points, of course. But on the traditional medicine side, you know, I've heard people give some of the most bogus, you know, reasons behind why that shouldn't be done. You know, they say people don't have the right quantities, they can't test the potency. That's why we have standards. You know, like plain and simple, that's why we have standards. And that'll address everything. Now, on the issue of women, I mean, I agree on this 100%. Again, I was very privileged and fortunate to have, you know, a balanced household where, you know, my parents were both well-educated, and they worked together as a team, and I saw that work very well. But there's something to be said about females and the allocation of resources and the efficiency of allocation of resources. And this is something that, you know, I also experienced in Ethiopia when I was there for the African Union Summit in 2019, listening to some incredible statistics. I mean, things that I had intuitive knowledge of. But when you think about the basic situation where, you know, the father works in a mine somewhere and the mom stays with the kids, the dad doesn't bring 100% of the earnings back home. You know, there might be overindulgence in entertainment in some instances, on a very small paycheck, by the way. So by all means, if we do encourage the mothers, the women, as breadwinners who can support themselves and the children, then it has such a powerful multiplier. When women are able to be economically independent, kids go to school, you know, consistently, you know, throughout their life. kids have a balanced diet, and a balanced diet, clean drinking water, and good education are the foundation for the whole economy. Because then you have people who aren't sick because their immune systems are fortified, their sense of themselves and their knowledge grows. So you won't have children who are misguided and going to jail. And once you start doing that, you take pressure off of the government in spending on jails. We all know that America is actually a very good example where young, misguided men and women cost the government a lot of money.
Yes.
And the multipliers are unbelievable. So for me, I honestly do believe that women, leading the charge in economics is something that is very natural for them to do.
Yes.
And I believe that men belong on the battlefield and in the courtroom. That's my own belief, because society has changed so much. In Napoleon's time, I guess, the emperor went to war with the men, but now that doesn't happen. And so we have to understand why men have always been heads of state. And now is a time to realize that the shift has actually created, a separation of duties, if you would say,
Yes.
at a government level. So I really appreciate those issues that you pointed out there. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Right.
Yes,
so, and the next one is, in your experience, what is the best role that investors can play in the development of a country? Also, are there any success stories that you can share where investors and large corporations have worked successfully with government?
Unfortunately, on our continent, I really cannot think of immediate answers to that question, but I can take the question from the other way around. I mean, if you look at a lot of the major technologies we enjoy right now, in fact, for example, the IT, we're looking at communication technologies. All these have been the products of research going on in the military in the United States, and even in the internet. I mean, this is how it all started. So I think there has been investment from the public, because it's the government that have invested in the military and developing all these technologies, taken up by the private sector, and then we have seen where that has taken us. I think increasingly, this has been the model that had got us to where we are nowadays. But I increasingly believe, that's why I go back again to what I had said earlier on, in terms of engagement of the private sector in the public sector, I see the potential through universities, for example. I see the potential when there is more engagement on the part of the private sector to be looking very closely at the research, when the government or the institution protects that research, and that research finding is then developed in the private sector. And I think if we get this kind of the very sanctified triangle of the public sector, the private sector, the philanthropies all working together, I think we can see things happening faster. But the triple helix, as people increasingly have been referring it to. So I think this is what we'll have to address if we want to see further investment and, of course, further development, of course, leading eventually towards job creation, because this is what we want at the end of the day, is to empower our people, to provide them with jobs and opportunities. And so we really need to look at this triple helix moving ahead.
I agree with you 100%. Well, Your Excellency, it's been an absolute honor and a pleasure. As I said, for my own selfish reasons, I really loved, talking to you today. And I thank you so much for your time. If there's anything else you would like to add, I would appreciate that very much. But if not, it's been an absolute delight. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I hope that one day we'll meet physically.
I hope so too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.